I'm John Batchelor. Thaddeus McCotter, my colleague and co-host and friend, author of Liberty Risen, is at WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. Thaddeus, in Congress, you observed military men and women come forward, the uniforms, and tell of their service overseas during the wars, early part of this century, that continue. And one of the hallmarks I have read and I have experienced of men and women who have been in danger, especially combat, is that they are extremely quiet and discreet and even avoiding talking about their experience. Did you have a similar experience, Thaddeus?
Yes, John, that's always been my experience as well with our veterans, especially those who have been in active combat theaters. And there's a host of reasons why that occurs, but that is generally a very consistent theme with them, right, is that they do not talk about it, and they certainly never brag about it.
Mona Charen of the National Review Online, writing most recently of one particular incident that is now, you'd have to say, infamous for Comcast, NBC, major broadcasting, which is Brian Williams, an extremely experienced and admired and successful anchor, news anchor, who has, over the years, the evidence now shows, consistently told and retold and shaped a story that is untrue of his experience in combat. Mona, a very good evening to you. I don't want to do psychology on Williams. I want to connect these facts, what we have now, Mr. Williams is no longer on air for the moment, with what you have experienced with war-telling veterans, people who talk about their experiences. Have you had a similar experience, Mona, where the reluctance is the mark of the combat veteran?
Yes, John, and by the way, it's lovely to be with you as always. I have noticed this with many people that I have met who have served in combat. They are very reluctant to talk about it. One of them was my late uncle, who was a Marine and served at Iwo Jima. And he did not really speak about that experience until 50 years after the fact, when he was basically cajoled into it for an oral history project. And even then, you know, he was willing to talk, but he was kind of taciturn and you know, didn't really relish relaying his experiences. And it was of course, as you know, it was a ghastly thing, Iwo Jima. So
Iwo Jima was a nightmare. You wouldn't want to remember it ever unless you were obliged to. What you have done is that you have connected this Williams tale, which is sad. It's tragic, really, because a man has damaged his reputation without cause that we can discern. Yes. You've connected this to a general disdain for the military from one part of one party. How so?
So what I was saying is that, you know, while, of course, Williams deserves the pickle that he has gotten himself into, he did this to himself, and so he's, you know, he told a lie, he's going to have to pay the price. But I said, in a way, he was paying tribute to true courage, to true honor, and he was acknowledging that people who do serve and who do put their lives on the line are worthy of respect and honor, and that we don't always treat them that way. And I was contrasting his sort of borrowed valor, Williams's, and I also mentioned Hillary Clinton did the same thing with her story about having been under sniper fire in Bosnia, which also was a made-up story. But I contrast that with the tone that so often comes from the left, and most recently was evidenced in the reception to the movie American Sniper, where some leading figures of the left, like Michael Moore and others, Bill Maher, were incredibly disdainful toward this man, Chris Kyle, who was who served his country, who was put himself in harm's way over and over and over again. Yes, he killed people. He was killing the enemy. That was what he was sent to do. But from their point of view, that made him into some sort of a moral monster. And it's such an injustice. I mean, the fact is, if we ever have the misfortune to run out of Chris Kyles in this country, that will be the end of us. I mean, we depend upon having brave young men who are willing to put themselves on the line that way, and it's a mark of the left too often, I think, to be disdainful of them or even to despise them.
Thaddeus?
Mona, one of the hardest things that any member of Congress has to do is to meet the families of the fallen soldiers, or to meet with the soldiers who are wounded at places such as Landstuhl Military Hospital over in Germany. And I think that in my experience has been that it affects both members on a both parties on a personal, emotional level. And yet within the ideological left, you continue to see this outdated, antiquated rhetoric that somehow are men and women in uniform who are protecting Americans, who are a force for moral good in the world, and who are advancing the cause of liberty through heroic sacrifice of themselves and that of their families, are somehow nothing but thugs of a capitalist patriarchy that needs to be destroyed. Am I about right in that?
You've got the vocabulary, boy. And I also, it should not be forgotten that the man who holds the exalted post of Secretary of State under this administration rose to prominence in America as the leader of something called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And young John Kerry came and testified before Congress many years ago and said things about the supposed atrocities that had been committed by American soldiers, and he compared our soldiers to Genghis Khan, and it was later found that none of these allegations could be substantiated. They were all either gross lies or terrible exaggerations. And yes, there were occasional, of course, there were war crimes committed. There are in every war, but what Kerry was suggesting was that this was commonplace and that this was the norm rather than the very, very, very rare exception. And he has never apologized for that. He has never acknowledged that he was wrong. It's a mark of shame. This is a man who participated in a demonstration where he supposedly threw his medals over the White House fence or the Pentagon or one of those places, threw them over a fence as if to say, that he had such contempt for the country that he had served that he didn't want the medals that had been awarded to him. And funny thing happened a few years later. A journalist with a long memory, was interviewing Kerry in his Senate office and noticed the medals were framed and on the wall. So apparently he hadn't thrown his medals. He probably threw someone else's.
It was called the Winter Soldier Investigation.
Exactly.
For younger people. I lived through the Vietnam War. It's my generation's darkness. And the torment of memories about being for the war, being against the war, coming back in uniform, being derided because you had served in a war that was regarded as criminal. The torrent of all that comes back when you watch the Winter Soldier Investigation, because the worst accusations that Mr. Kerry made in his testimony to Congress, and I will not read his transcript, but it's filled with abuse, but it's the abuse of cartoons, because substantial investigation demonstrated that none or little of this had happened, and that there had been testimony of frauds involved in the Winter investigation. And Mona's pointing to something that I know it's a footnote, but he is the Secretary of State, and Mrs. Clinton was the Secretary of State, and Mr. Williams is like a Secretary of State, Mona. And what's striking here is we're talking about people who have been raised up in national voices.
And John, the irony, the cruelty of all of this is that Brian Williams is being held to account, but Kerry and Clinton aren't.
Thaddeus, This doesn't feel just partisan. This feels like something goes wrong with celebrity speakers. That's what it feels like. I'm certain that there have been phony war stories as long as there has been war. But at this level, Thaddeus, did you experience anything like this in Congress? Any other member of Congress boasting like this?
No, not to my recollection. In fact, as I said before, whenever we took those trips to visit our men and women in uniform,
right.
Both parties were equally moved by it. And I will say that I agree with you that it is inexplicable why someone of Mr. Williams' intellect and stature has done this. Maybe there were competitive pressures.
I know, he's like a senator. That's how prominent the position is.
Well, let's not degrade the man any more than he's already been.
Fine, I take it back.
Point taken. But I'll say this. On our first Codell over to Iraq when I was a freshman member of Congress, we went to Landstuhl Military Prison. It was right after one of the Chinooks had been hit and knocked down, and we met an American serviceman. And one of the members with us asked him, well, how do you feel about your experience? And he looked at us from his hospital bed and said, I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy. That was the enemy that had just shot him down, and that shows you what I said before. Our men and women are a force for moral good in the world, and I can understand why people would wish to associate them with them, but that's not the way to do it.
Williams, we won't walk away from this. Mona, do we want him back? Do we need him back? Does this disavow what he can do for the country?
You know, it might not be a bad thing for him to get his position back, because he will be the carefulest journalist in Washington after this experience, I suspect.
Thaddeus, do we want back a national speaker who has misled so over a long period of time about something so important?
I don't know. It's very difficult, setting aside the individual, for journalism itself to have that type of credibility impugned and then try to rehabilitate it. It's very difficult, and ultimately the audience will make that determination if he does come back.
Thaddeus McCotter at WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. Mona Charen of the National Review Online. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.